The first thing I saw were her shoes, worn thin at the soles, resting against the tire of a dusty white van parked beside pump number 4. At that moment, I didn't recognize the van, didn't recognize the small shape curled up inside, and certainly didn't recognize the quiet horror creeping up my spine. I was only stopping for gas, only planning to refill my tank and grab a coffee before the long drive home. But when I glanced through the fogged window and saw a child sleeping on a pile of blankets, thumb tucked into his mouth, my heart stuttered. And then I saw her face, my daughter's face, pale, exhausted, and marked with the kind of pain no mother should ever see on her child. That was the moment my life split cleanly in two, because nothing would ever be the same again after that gas station. Before we go any further, if you're someone who believes families should protect each other, if you believe injustice deserves consequences, make sure you subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from today, because stories like this reach hearts all over the world, and I want to know where you are as you hear mine. I stood frozen for several seconds, my hand still gripping the gas pump handle, unable to move. My daughter, my bright, stubborn, loving daughter, was supposed to be safe. She was supposed to be sleeping in the apartment I had bought for her with my own savings, the place I had chosen carefully because it was close to a park and a good school. That apartment was supposed to be her fresh start, her security, her promise that no matter what happened in life, she and her child would always have a roof over their heads. Yet there she was, sleeping in a van at a gas station like someone the world had forgotten. I walked closer, my footsteps slow and heavy, as if the ground itself were resisting me. When I tapped gently on the van window, she stirred, confusion flickering across her face before recognition hit. Her eyes widened, then filled with tears so fast they spilled over before she could stop them. She opened the door and whispered my name, like she was afraid I might disappear if she said it too loudly. I pulled her into my arms, holding her and my grandson together, feeling how thin she'd become, how tense her body was, like she'd been bracing for impact every second of every day. We sat on the curb beside the van, the smell of gasoline thick in the air, the sound of cars coming and going, like the world was continuing as normal while ours was falling apart. I looked at her and asked the question that had been burning through my chest since the moment I recognized her. "Where is the apartment I bought for you?" The words came out sharper than I intended, edged with disbelief and dread. She didn't answer right away. Instead, her shoulders began to shake. She covered her face with her hands and cried in a way that told me this wasn't a single bad day, but a long, cruel story she'd been carrying alone. When she finally spoke, her voice was broken and hoarse. She told me her husband and his mother had said she had no right to the apartment. They told her it wasn't really hers, that since her name wasn't on certain papers, she didn't deserve it. They told her she was ungrateful, useless, and a burden. Then one night, after an argument she tried desperately to calm, they packed her things into trash bags, took her child from his bed, and put them outside. She said her mother-in-law stood in the doorway watching, arms crossed, while her husband locked the door behind them. No apology, no explanation, just silence and a closed door. As she spoke, something inside me went cold and sharp. I had raised my daughter to be kind, to be patient, to believe love meant endurance. But I had also raised her to know her worth. And the fact that anyone thought they could discard her like that made my blood boil. I stood up so suddenly, she flinched, probably thinking she'd said something wrong. I looked her straight in the eyes and said the words that would change everything. "Get out. Come with me, now. You're not sleeping here another night. Not you, not my grandchild. Not ever again. I helped her gather what little she had left, loading bags into my car while my grandson clung to my leg, eyes wide and silent. As I buckled him into the back seat, I made a promise to myself that the people who did this would learn a lesson they would never forget. This wasn't just about shelter anymore. This was about dignity, about justice, and about reminding two very cruel people that you do not get to destroy a mother and child without consequences. As we pulled away from the gas station, my daughter looked at me like she was waiting for the world to collapse again. I reached over and squeezed her hand, steady and firm. I told her she was safe now, but inside, I was already planning. Because when a grandmother decides to fight for her family, she doesn't do it halfway. She does it in a way that leaves a mark. That night, after I'd brought them home, I barely slept. My daughter and grandson were settled into the guest room, finally warm, finally fed, finally safe. But my mind refused to rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing in that gas station parking lot, clutching her child like a shield against the world. I replayed her words over and over, especially the way she said her husband's name, like it tasted bitter in her mouth now. I had trusted that man once. I had smiled at his mother, shared meals with her, listened politely to her thinly veiled criticisms. And all the while, they had been planning to erase my daughter from her own life. In the quiet hours before dawn, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wall. I wasn't shouting or pacing or crying. I was doing something far more dangerous. I was thinking. I pulled out a folder from my cabinet, one I hadn't opened in a long time. Inside were documents related to the apartment. Every receipt, every contract, every legal detail was there, neatly organized, because that's the kind of woman I've always been. When I bought that apartment, I didn't do it casually. I did it with intention. I did it with protection in mind. And as I reread those papers under the soft kitchen light, a slow, grim smile spread across my face. In the morning, my daughter woke looking disoriented, like she wasn't sure if she was still in a dream. I made breakfast, kissed my grandson's head, and told her to take the day to rest. She started to apologize, the words tumbling out in a rush, saying she was sorry to be a burden, sorry for causing trouble, sorry for not telling me sooner. I stopped her mid-sentence. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. I told her that what happened wasn't her failure, but someone else's cruelty. Then I told her something that made her eyes widen with fear and hope mixed together. I told her I was going to handle it. That afternoon, I drove to the apartment. I didn't call ahead. I didn't warn anyone. I parked my car calmly and walked up the stairs, with the same steady pace I used when I'd first toured the place years ago. When the door opened, it was my son-in-law who stood there, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion when he saw me. Behind him, his mother hovered like a shadow, her lips tightening the moment she realized I wasn't there for pleasantries. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult them. I simply asked why my daughter and grandson were no longer living there. They gave excuses first. They said it was a misunderstanding, that my daughter had left on her own, that she was unstable, dramatic, irresponsible. His mother chimed in, saying it was better this way, that the child needed discipline, that my daughter was lucky they'd tolerated her as long as they had. I listened quietly, nodding, letting them talk themselves deeper into their own lies. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out the documents. I placed them on the kitchen table, one by one, like cards in a game they didn't realize they were losing. I told them I was the legal owner of the apartment. I told them it was purchased with my money, registered under my name, and that any permission they had to live there was conditional. Their faces changed instantly. My son-in-law's confidence drained away, replaced by panic. His mother scoffed, trying to maintain control, saying paperwork didn't matter, that family matters were decided differently. That's when I told her something she clearly hadn't expected. I told her that by locking my daughter and grandson out, they had violated the agreement I had made, and that their right to occupy that apartment was revoked. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. My son-in-law started to argue, his voice rising, but I held up a hand. I told him I wasn't finished. I told him I had already spoken to a lawyer that morning. I told him that if he didn't vacate the apartment within 48 hours, I would begin formal eviction proceedings, and that given the circumstances, I would also be pursuing legal action regarding the illegal removal of my daughter and child. His mother's face went pale. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, realizing for the first time that she had underestimated me. Chapter P. I left without another word, my heart pounding, but my steps steady. On the drive home, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Power. Not the cruel kind, but the kind that comes from knowing you're standing on truth. When I got back, my daughter was sitting on the couch, nervously twisting her hands. I told her what I'd done. At first, she was terrified, worried she'd made things worse, worried about retaliation, worried about her child. I knelt in front of her, took her hands, and looked her straight in the eyes. I told her that sometimes the people who hurt you rely on your fear to keep hurting you. And today, that fear was no longer in charge. P. That night, my grandson laughed for the first time in days, chasing a toy across the living room floor. My daughter watched him with tears in her eyes, a small, fragile smile forming on her lips. I knew then that this wasn't over. Not even close. Because what I had started wasn't just about reclaiming an apartment. It was about reclaiming a life. And the real consequences were still to come.
I'm scared.
The next 2 days unfolded like a quiet storm, tense and heavy with anticipation. My daughter stayed close to home, barely checking her phone, jumping every time it buzzed. I told her to block their numbers, at least for now, but I kept mine open. I wanted to hear every word they had to say. Sure enough, the calls started coming that very evening. First, from my son-in-law, his voice suddenly polite, almost respectful, asking if we could talk things through calmly, like adults. I told him calmly that adults don't throw mothers and children onto the street, and then I hung up. The second call came from his mother, and this one was pure venom. She accused me of poisoning my daughter's mind, of interfering in a marriage, of ruining her son's future. I let her speak until she ran out of breath. Then I said quietly that the future she was worried about had already been ruined by her own actions. Then I hung up on her too. On the third morning, a moving truck pulled up in front of the apartment building. A neighbor I knew called to tell me, her voice buzzing with gossip and disbelief. My son-in-law and his mother were carrying boxes out. Their movements, stiff and angry. Word travels fast in places like that, and I knew people were watching from behind curtains, whispering, piecing together what must have happened. The afternoon, the apartment was empty. I drove there myself, unlocked the door, and stood in the silent rooms. It smelled stale, like resentment and neglect. I opened the windows, letting fresh air pour in, and for the first time since the gas station, I felt like I could breathe. I brought my daughter and grandson back that same evening. She hesitated at the doorway, clutching her child, as if expecting someone to jump out and tell her she didn't belong. I told her to step inside. I told her this was her home again. When she finally crossed the threshold, she broke down, sinking to the floor, crying with a mix of relief and grief. I sat beside her and held her until the tears slowed. That night, she tucked her son into his own bed, kissed his forehead, and whispered promises I knew she intended to keep. But even as peace settled in, I knew the story wasn't finished. People like my son-in-law and his mother don't accept defeat quietly. A week later, my daughter received a message from a mutual friend. Apparently, my son-in-law had been telling everyone that my daughter was unstable, that she'd abandoned her marriage, that I had manipulated the situation to steal his home. His mother, not to be outdone, was spreading rumors that my daughter was an unfit parent. When my daughter showed me the messages, her hands were shaking again, old fear rising to the surface. I felt that familiar cold resolve return. If they wanted a war of stories, I was prepared to tell the truth, loudly and clearly. I contacted the lawyer again, not just about property, but about custody and defamation. I gathered evidence meticulously. Messages, witnesses, timelines, even photos of the night my daughter and grandson were locked out. I spoke to neighbors who had seen her standing outside with trash bags, to the gas station clerk who remembered her sleeping in the van. Each piece fit together into a picture that could not be denied. My daughter watched all of this with disbelief, like she couldn't understand how the world that had crushed her so easily was now being pushed back inch by inch. The confrontation came sooner than expected. One afternoon, my son-in-law showed up at my door unannounced. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders slumped, his arrogance replaced by desperation. He said he just wanted to see his child. He said he missed his family. I told him calmly that access to a child is not a bargaining chip, and that his concern would have meant more if it had appeared before he threw them out. He tried anger next, accusing me of turning my daughter against him. Then he tried guilt, saying his mother was sick with worry, saying the stress was too much. I listened, unmoved. Finally, I told him that any communication from now on would go through our lawyer, and that if he truly cared about his child, he would start by taking responsibility for what he'd done. After he left, my daughter sat beside me in silence. She asked me quietly how I could stay so calm. I told her that rage burns fast and leaves nothing behind, but patience builds something lasting. She nodded, absorbing that lesson the way only someone who's been broken can. Over the next few weeks, she started to change. She slept better. She laughed more. She enrolled her son in preschool nearby and began looking for work again, her confidence slowly returning. Watching her rebuild was the greatest reward I could have asked for. Then came the day the legal papers arrived. My son-in-law was being investigated for illegal eviction and emotional abuse, and his mother was named as a contributing party. The rumors they had spread came back to haunt them when confronted with evidence. Their friends grew quiet. Their supporters disappeared. Actions, it turned out, have echoes. When my daughter read the papers, she cried again. But this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from relief. She hugged me and said she didn't know how she would have survived without me. I told her she was stronger than she knew. I just reminded her of it. As I left the apartment that evening, I looked back at the lit windows, my grandson's laughter floating out into the night. I knew the lesson had been delivered, but the consequences were still unfolding. And for the first time, I felt certain that the people who tried to destroy my family were finally understanding what they had awakened. By the time the court date was set, the tension had shifted. It was no longer my daughter who woke up with knots in her stomach, or checked the locks twice before bed. It was them. I could sense it in every clipped message that came through the lawyer, in every delay tactic, every sudden request to resolve things privately. They were afraid, and fear has a way of exposing the truth people try hardest to hide. My daughter, meanwhile, was slowly reclaiming herself. She started cooking again, experimenting with recipes she'd abandoned years earlier. She began taking evening walks with her son, holding his small hand as they circled the block, her posture straighter each day. Watching her heal was proof that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, creates ripples you can't always see at first. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, plain and almost dull. But the air inside it felt heavy with consequence. My daughter sat beside me, hands folded tightly in her lap, while my son-in-law sat across the room with his mother. She avoided looking at us, her chin lifted in that familiar posture of superiority. But her hands betrayed her, fingers twitching constantly. When the judge began reviewing the case, the excuses unraveled quickly. The illegal eviction was clear. The messages were undeniable. The witness statements painted a picture they could not twist to their advantage. When my daughter was asked to speak, her voice trembled at first, then steadied. She described the night she was locked out, the humiliation of sleeping in a van, the fear in her child's eyes. The room was silent as she spoke, and for the first time, I saw my son-in-law lower his head. The ruling came swiftly. Temporary custody favored my daughter. My son-in-law was ordered to attend counseling and parenting classes if he wanted supervised visitation. His mother was formally warned to cease all interference, her name now part of an official record she could never erase. But the moment that truly mattered wasn't written on any document. It was the look on their faces when they realized they had lost control completely. Not just of property or reputation, but of the narrative they'd tried to create. Truth had replaced their lies, and it was far louder. After the hearing, my daughter stood outside the courthouse, breathing deeply, like someone who had just surfaced from deep water. She smiled, really smiled, and hugged me so tightly I felt her heart pounding. She said she felt free, and I knew exactly what she meant. Freedom isn't the absence of struggle. It's the presence of support when struggle comes. That evening, we celebrated quietly with takeout and laughter on the living room floor. My grandson proudly showing off a drawing he'd made at preschool. Life, ordinary and precious, was returning. But consequences have layers, and the deepest ones often arrive later. A few weeks after the court ruling, my son-in-law lost his job. Not because I orchestrated it, not because I interfered, but because his behavior had finally followed him into the light. Workplace rumors, background checks, and his own documented instability caught up with him. His mother, once so proud of her social standing, found invitations drying up. People talk. They always do. And when they talk about cruelty toward a child, doors close quietly but firmly. One afternoon, my daughter received a letter from her mother-in-law. It was long and rambling, filled with half apologies and self-pity, blaming stress, misunderstanding, even my daughter herself. There was no real accountability in it. My daughter read it once, folded it carefully, and put it away. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply said she was done living inside someone else's excuses. That, more than anything, told me how far she'd come. Months passed. Seasons changed. The apartment filled with warmth and routine. My daughter found a job she enjoyed, one that respected her time and allowed her to be present for her son. They built traditions together. movie nights and Sunday breakfasts, small rituals that stitched their lives back together. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit with me and talk about how close she'd come to believing she deserved what happened to her. Each time, I reminded her that abuse thrives in silence and isolation, and that speaking up, even late, is an act of courage. I occasionally heard updates about my son-in-law and his mother through distant channels. Legal fees strained them, relationships fractured. The authority they once wielded dissolved. I didn't take pleasure in their suffering, but I didn't feel guilty either. Consequences are not revenge. They are lessons delivered by reality itself. And reality, unlike people, does not lie. One evening, as I watched my grandson fall asleep in his bed, his face relaxed and peaceful, I thought back to that gas station, to the van, to the shock that had nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. That moment had been terrifying, yes, but it had also been a turning point. Pain has a way of forcing clarity, of revealing who you are when it matters most. That day, I had chosen not just to rescue my daughter, but to stand between her and a world that had tried to break her. I would make that choice again without hesitation. When my daughter thanked me, I told her something I hoped she would remember forever. I told her that love isn't proven by words or promises, but by action when it costs you something. And that sometimes, the fiercest love comes wrapped in resolve, patience, and an unshakable refusal to accept injustice as normal. As the lights dimmed and the apartment settled into quiet, I knew our story was no longer about survival. It was about strength reclaimed and a future rebuilt on truth. The transformation didn't happen all at once, but there came a day when I noticed my daughter humming while she folded laundry. And I realized the heaviness that once clung to her had finally begun to lift. Trauma doesn't leave dramatically. It fades in small, almost unnoticeable ways. The flinching stops. The apologies slow down. The fear loosens its grip. She no longer checked her phone with dread or froze when an unfamiliar car parked outside. She had started to trust the world again, or at least her place in it. And that was something no court ruling could grant. Only time and safety could. Still, healing has a way of reopening old doors before it closes them for good. One afternoon, my daughter asked if we could talk. We sat at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the worn wood, and she told me she felt guilty. Guilty for involving me. Guilty for taking her child away from his father. Guilty for surviving something others told her she should have endured quietly. I listened carefully, then told her something I had learned the hard way in my own life. Guilt is often what abusers leave behind when they walk away. It's the echo of manipulation, not a measure of truth. She nodded slowly, tears in her eyes, and I could see that something important had settled inside her. Around that time, my son-in-law made one last attempt to regain control. Through his lawyer, he requested mediation, painting himself as a man desperate to rebuild his family. On paper, it sounded reasonable. In reality, it was a calculated move. Mediation would give him access, leverage, a stage. After careful consideration, we declined. Boundaries are not punishment, they are protection. And for the first time, my daughter didn't look to me for reassurance when that decision was made. She stood firm on her own. The consequences of his actions continued to ripple outward. The parenting classes he was required to attend were missed more than once, each absence recorded. Supervised visits became sporadic, then rare. His mother, once loud and domineering, withdrew almost completely. People who rely on intimidation crumble when it no longer works. Their silence was not peace, but it was distance, and distance was enough. What mattered most was what was happening inside our walls. My grandson thrived. He made friends. He stopped waking up from nightmares. Children understand safety long before they can explain it. One evening, he asked my daughter if the van was gone forever. She smiled and told him it was. Later, she cried quietly in the bathroom, mourning the fact that he'd ever had to ask that question at all. Healing doesn't erase memory, but it changes its power. As for me, I was changed too. People often think grandmothers are gentle by default, that we exist only to soothe and soften. But love that spans generations carries a different kind of strength. I wasn't driven by anger anymore. I was driven by certainty. Certainty that silence would have destroyed my daughter. Certainty that intervention, even messy and uncomfortable, had saved her. Certainty that doing nothing would have been the real crime. One evening, months after the court case, my daughter invited me to stay for dinner. She cooked confidently, music playing softly in the background, her movements sure and unhurried. Halfway through the meal, she looked at me and said she wanted to tell her story someday, publicly, not for revenge, but so other women might recognize themselves sooner. I felt a swell of pride so deep it almost hurt. Pain, when processed, becomes purpose, and purpose is powerful. The final blow for my son-in-law and his mother came quietly. No shouting, no confrontation. The apartment lease was formally restructured, securing my daughter's long-term stability. Their names were removed entirely, legally, permanently. The last thread of control they had imagined was gone. When the confirmation arrived, my daughter read it, smiled, and placed it in a drawer, without ceremony. Closure doesn't always need an audience. On the anniversary of the night I found her at the gas station, we did something symbolic. We drove past it. Just once. The same pumps, the same harsh lights. But this time, we didn't stop. We kept driving. My daughter reached over and held my hand, squeezing gently. Neither of us spoke, because we didn't need to. Some moments are meant to be felt, not explained. That night, as I prepared to leave, my daughter hugged me and said something that stayed with me. She said, "You didn't just save us. You reminded me who I was before I forgot." That is the kind of impact that outlives any revenge. That is the kind of justice that endures. And if there's one thing I want anyone listening to this story to understand, it's this. Cruelty often counts on invisibility. It survives because no one looks too closely, because victims are taught to minimize their pain. But the moment someone steps in and says, "Enough," everything changes. A grandmother can be that someone. A friend, a stranger, even you. Sometimes the most unforgettable revenge isn't destruction. It's rebuilding so completely that the people who tried to break you no longer recognize the world they once controlled. By the time winter arrived, the story had settled into something quieter, but no less meaningful. The drama had faded from headlines and gossip, replaced by routine, and that was exactly how healing often announced itself. No grand finale, no triumphant music. Just ordinary days stacking gently on top of one another. My daughter woke early, packed her son's lunch, kissed his forehead, and went to work. In the evenings, she helped him with drawings and letters, listened patiently to his stories, and tucked him into bed with a sense of peace that once felt impossible. Watching them, I understood that safety is not loud, it's steady. Still, the past has a way of testing whether lessons have truly been learned. One evening, my daughter received a message from someone she hadn't heard from in months. It was a mutual acquaintance, asking cautiously whether the rumors were true, whether she had really taken everything from her husband. The wording stung. Old doubts tried to resurface. I saw it in her eyes before she said a word. Instead of shrinking, she took a breath and replied with the truth. She explained what had happened, calmly, clearly, without apology. Then she put the phone down. No spiraling. No need for validation. That was when I knew she had crossed an invisible line from survivor to someone who owned her story. My grandson brought home a school assignment around that time. It was simple. Draw your family. He drew himself, his mother, and me, all holding hands in front of a building with bright windows. No father, no van, no confusion, just certainty. My daughter stared at the drawing for a long time, then pinned it to the refrigerator like it was a medal. Children tell the truth without words. That picture said more than any courtroom transcript ever could. I sometimes wondered whether my son-in-law or his mother felt regret, whether late at night, when distractions fell away, they replayed their choices and felt the weight of them. But wondering didn't change anything. Accountability had already done its work. My focus was forward, not backward. That, too, was a lesson I wanted my daughter to learn. You don't heal by staring at the wound. You heal by building a life that makes the wound smaller. One afternoon, she surprised me by asking about my own past. About choices I'd made, mistakes I'd survived, strength I'd had to find when no one else was watching. I told her stories I'd never told before, not because they were shameful, but because I'd never thought they mattered. She listened intently, and I saw understanding dawn. Strength is inherited not just through blood, but through example. Sometimes it skips a generation and comes roaring back when needed most. The last time my son-in-law attempted contact, it was indirect and desperate. A message passed through someone else, asking if we could let things go for the sake of peace. I laughed softly when I heard it. Peace had already been achieved. Just not on his terms. Peace built on silence and submission is not peace at all. It's surrender. And surrender was no longer an option for my daughter. As the year turned, we marked milestones quietly. My grandson's birthday. My daughter's first full year at her job. Small celebrations, candles on cakes, laughter echoing off the walls. Each moment was an act of defiance against the past. Not loud, not angry, but resolute. I realized then that the most powerful response to cruelty is not obsession, but indifference. When someone loses their ability to hurt you, they lose everything they thought they had. One evening, as we sat together watching my grandson sleep, my daughter said she no longer felt afraid of the world. Cautious, yes. Wiser, definitely, but not afraid. She said she trusted herself now, trusted her instincts, trusted that if something felt wrong, she would act sooner. That trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild, but she had done it, brick by brick. I thought back to the gas station again, to the way that moment had seemed like an ending when it was really a beginning. Pain often disguises itself that way. It tells you everything is over, when in truth, everything is about to change. That night had stripped away illusions, but it had also revealed something unbreakable. A mother's love, a grandmother's resolve, a child's right to safety. Those things don't disappear, no matter how dark it gets. If there is a message in all of this, it's not about revenge or victory. It's about intervention, about refusing to look away, about understanding that stepping in, even when it's uncomfortable, can alter the course of someone's entire life. I didn't save my daughter by being extraordinary. I saved her by being present, by listening, and by acting when it mattered. Now, when I see her walking confidently down the street with her son, laughter in their steps, I feel a quiet pride that needs no audience. The people who tried to erase her are now footnotes in a story she controls, and that is the most unforgettable outcome of all. There is a moment, often unnoticed, when a story truly ends. Not with a bang or a confrontation, but with acceptance. For us, it came on an ordinary morning when my daughter left for work, coffee in hand, her son's backpack slung over her shoulder as he raced ahead to the car. She paused, waved at me, and smiled without hesitation. No shadow crossed her face. No weight pulled her back. She was simply living. That was when I knew the chapter had closed. We didn't speak much about the past anymore, not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer demanded attention. The memories existed, yes, but they had softened, like stones worn smooth by water. My daughter no longer defined herself by what she had survived, but by what she was building. She made plans without fear of interruption. She laughed without checking who was listening. She trusted joy again, and that trust was hard-won. One evening, she asked me why I had reacted so quickly that day at the gas station. Why I hadn't hesitated or doubted her or told her to work it out quietly. I told her the truth. I said that when I saw her sleeping in that van, something ancient woke up inside me. A recognition that no rule, no politeness, no social expectation mattered more than protecting your own. I told her that love is not passive. It does not wait for permission. It moves when it must. She nodded, thoughtful, and said she hoped she would be that kind of mother someday. I told her she already was. Time continued to move forward as it always does. My grandson grew taller, louder, more curious. He forgot the van entirely. To him, it became just a story he half remembered, something that happened a long time ago. That was a gift I never took lightly. Children deserve memories rooted in safety, not survival. Watching him grow without fear felt like redemption in its purest form. As for me, I carried the lessons quietly. I learned that strength does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives in sensible shoes and a steady voice. Sometimes it looks like paperwork, patience, and persistence. Sometimes it is simply the refusal to accept cruelty as inevitable. I learned that age does not dull instinct. If anything, it sharpens it. You learn what matters. You learn what cannot be negotiated. I never saw my son-in-law or his mother again. There were no final apologies, no dramatic reckonings. Life handled them in its own way. Distance grew. Silence settled. And eventually, irrelevance took hold. That, more than anger or punishment, seemed to be the true ending of their power. They no longer occupied space in our days or our thoughts. They became echoes, faint and unimportant. On the anniversary of the gas station night, my daughter surprised me with a small gift. Inside the box was a simple keychain. It had a tiny house charm attached, solid and unbreakable. She told me it was a reminder, not of what she lost, but of what she reclaimed. I carried it with me from that day on. If you are listening to this and wondering what you would do in that moment, if you would have the courage to act, I want you to know something. Courage is not a personality trait. It is a decision. It is choosing discomfort over regret. It is stepping forward when silence feels easier. And it is available to anyone willing to reach for it. I found my daughter sleeping in a van at a gas station. That sentence still catches in my throat when I say it. But it no longer defines the story. What defines it is what came next. The choice to act. The refusal to look away. The understanding that family is not something you abandon when it becomes inconvenient. Today, my daughter lives in the apartment I bought for her, not as a gift, but as a foundation. She fills it with laughter, warmth, and possibility. Her son sleeps peacefully every night, unaware of how close he once came to a different life. And I wake each morning knowing that when the moment came, I did not hesitate. Some people call what I did revenge. They are wrong. Revenge seeks to destroy. What I did was restore. I restored safety. I restored dignity. I restored a future that had been nearly stolen. And that kind of restoration leaves a deeper mark than any punishment ever could. So, if there is one thing I hope stays with you after hearing this, it is this. When someone you love is pushed into the shadows, be the one who brings them back into the light. Ask the hard questions, demand the truth, and when necessary, say the words that change everything. Get out. Come with me now.